Turtle Bunbury has been variously described as one of Ireland's most prolific historians and amongst the most versatile authors of his generation. A frequent guest on TV and radio, he is also a well-known podcaster with series such as Global Irish, Waterways Through Time and Vanishing Ireland. Turtle has installed cultural heritage panels in 50 railway stations across Ireland, filled with historical tales for commuters as they await their trains. He has published over 20 books, including the best-selling Vanishing Ireland series, Ireland's Forgotten Past, and The Irish Diaspora, described as fascinating and impeccably researched by BBC History. Turtle researches and writes company histories, most recently for Adair Manor, Weirs and the centenary of Maxwell. His family has been associated with the Royal Dublin Society for many generations, and Turtle is both delighted and honoured to host and curate the RDS Speaker Series.
Happy out.
Great.
Hello, and you are very welcome to the RDS Library Speaker Series. My name is Turtle Bunbury. I'm a historian, and it is my immense pleasure to curate this series. The focus of the series is on Ireland's rich and controversial past. And it doesn't get much more controversial than our topic today, the burnings of the big houses. We are specifically talking about the burning of perhaps as many as 300 country houses across Ireland during the Irish Revolution, 1920 to 1923. These houses were, by and large, associated with the landed gentry and aristocracy, mostly Protestant. In other words, the people who had dominated Ireland throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. A declaration up front. I grew up in a big house. It still stands today, and I'm personally delighted that our family home was not lost to the flames 100 years ago. But many other houses were burned. And to talk with me about such matters, I'm thrilled to welcome Professor Terence Dooley, Director of the Centre for the Study of Historic Irish Houses and Estates. That is part of the prestigious History Department at Maynooth University in County Kildare. Terry is also the author of Burning the Big House, the country house in War and Revolution, 1914 to 1923, which has recently been published by Yale University Press. Terry, you are very welcome.
Well, thanks very much for having me here, Turtle.
Terry, it is such an emotive topic, the burning of the big houses. What drew you to write about it?
About 20 years ago, I published The Decline of the Big House in Ireland, which covered most of the period from about 1860 up to about 1960. And at the time, I remember thinking that each of the chapters therein could make for a book in itself. But this was particularly true of the chapter on the burning of big houses. And at the time, because it formed part of a much wider study, I mean, that's all that was devoted to it, was a single chapter. And the research was based on fairly limited sources, Irish Times, for example, police reports, and a limited number of compensation files. And coinciding then with the decade of commemorations, I thought this is a very good time to revisit this particular topic. But especially because of the release of all the new primary sources over the last number of years. The Bureau of Military History records, the IRA pension files, brigade reports, witness reports.
And it's amazing, isn't it? There's so much new information out there, as you say.
Absolutely huge. And in fact, that then becomes one of the biggest challenges in order to try to work your way through all of these sources and try to make sense of them. And of course, be very careful of the bias that's in each of them.
Of course, yeah.
So with that result then, I mean, part of the book, deals with specific case studies so that you bore right down into the micro level.
Into the particular houses, right.
Houses.
Okay, the first thing I want to look at is the sort of legacy, because with Irish nationalism and republicanism going back into the 18th century, I know that some big houses were destroyed during the 1798 rebellion, but apart from that, was there a sort of history of targeting the big house?
No, I think after 1798, I mean, there isn't. as such. Not physical targeting, at any rate, right? But with, for example, the outbreak of the land war from 1879 onwards, it begins with, if you like, a rhetorical attack on the big houses. I mean, from land league platforms, the big house is suddenly painted as a symbol of colonial oppression because of its association with landlordism, the Anglo-Irish aristocracy, and the fact that by targeting landlords, you're actually taking a dual approach. You're dealing with the national question, which is one of independence, and you're dealing with the land question, which ultimately has at its core the transfer of land ownership from landlords to tenants.
Yeah, okay, which is like the massive revolution that will kick off in the late 19th century. Yeah, it is. So we then, if we move into the after the Easter Rising, into the War of Independence, it is a war. Big houses are seen to an extent as enemy territory. But when do the gloves come off? When does the first big house get torched?
Well, if you go back through, I suppose, the previous question, I mean, during the 19th century, it's obviously, even if they had ambition or intention to target the big house, you had the countryside full of policemen, crown forces and military and so on. But in the spring of 1920, when the IRA begins its systematic campaign of targeting RIC barracks, and the RIC are pushed from the countryside into the larger urban areas, then huge swathes of the countryside are freed up, right? Okay. So the IRA have more freedom of movement, and big houses become more susceptible than they would have been at any other time in their previous history.
Because there's no protection at that point.
There's no real protection. I mean, there are patrols, but the owners themselves, the house owners themselves, continuously complain about the fact that patrols are never in the right place at the right time. But of course they're not, because the IRA, I mean, are actually, I mean, they're planning, I would say in most cases, when they're actually going to launch an attack on a house. And so in that spring of 1920, you have the beginning of the burnings, but preceding that, you also have, you know, innumerable raids on houses by volunteers who are presuming that, of course, they're full of arms and ammunition. And as well as attacking RIC barracks for that purpose, then they also attack country houses.
Okay, so yes, so they're starting to go in there to try and grab shotguns and whatever else they can get.
Yes.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, with the RIC barracks being evacuated, and then you've also got the black and tans are starting to arrive in, and the Auxies and so on. That's presumably changing the shape of it.
That changes the dynamic, so to speak, because I mean now the reinforcements, the black and tans and the auxiliaries, are without barracks. So what happens is they begin to commandeer big houses for use as temporary barracks, right? And as a result of that, then the houses themselves become, if you like, legitimate targets, legitimate military targets for the IRA.
Of course, I mean, it's your enemy's base.
Yes, so when rumours begin to circulate that houses like Summerhill are about to be commandeered and used by the auxiliaries or the black and tans, I mean, the IRA take the preemptive step of actually destroying these houses, burning these houses. Or in some cases when they actually leave, when the Crown forces leave, the IRA will then attack them, right? And one, you could argue it was to ensure that they didn't actually come back again. But I think what needs to be emphasized is that while it might look like this is the reason for doing it, very often there are numerous other reasons beginning to feed into the destruction from that point onwards.
Multiple motives. Okay, so tell me more. What are we talking about there?
Right. Well, so if we confine it to the War of Independence, right? So as the War of Independence escalates, so there's the type of war, reprisal, counter-reprisal. So now big houses become targets of the IRA for counter-reprisal purposes. Okay,
so counter-reprisal for what?
Yeah, so if there is an IRA ambush, for example, in a locality.
Yes.
As happens, I'll give best maybe to work off an example in cases like this. So take the case of Moydrum in County Westmeath.
Moydrum.
Moydrum Castle. Home
Moydrum, which is famous as being on the cover of the U2 album, The Unforgettable Fire.
Unforgettable Fire, exactly.
Castlemaine's
which was
house.
one of the headlines in the newspapers sometimes after its destruction.
After it's burning, okay, right.
So this is June 1921, so it's pretty close to actually the Anglo-Irish truce. And Colonel Thomas Lambert and a party are travelling from a tennis party outside Athlone back to barracks in the town itself. And the IRA have set up a roadblock, the intention being to probably kidnap Lambert and hold him as a hostage for the release of General Sean McGowan, one of the prominent local leaders of the IRA. Lambert decides to break the blockade, and the IRA open fire, and he subsequently dies from his wounds later that evening. And just shortly afterwards, the Black and Tans then go on a rampage through the neighbouring village of Knockcrockery, just across the
Roscommon.
Roscommon. Yeah. And they burn 15 or 17 houses and premises in the town on the night, and the ordinary civilian population are forced to flee, etc. Then a few nights later, they then attack 5 or 6 farmhouses in the ambush site, which had become, fairly much part of policy. And they burn these farmhouses, and the IRA then decide that there has to be a counter-reprisal. Now, according to the local IRA leader who was involved, Thomas Costello, he said that the first order they got from headquarters, general headquarters, was to destroy a number of loyalist homes in the area. And he, in his witness statement later on, said that, no, why would we do that? Because these people had no role in it. Mm-hmm. But what we decided to do instead was to attack Moydrum Castle, which is the home of Lord Castlemaine. Now, of course, Castlemaine is a loyalist, he's a unionist. One other IRA witness stated afterwards that during the Great War, he had sacked men from his employment because they wouldn't enlist in the British Army. Okay. So you're building up now, a series of different...
A CV ripe for it, by the sounds of things, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the IRA attacked it on a particular night in June 1921, and the house is burned. However...
Was Castlemaine present?
Castlemaine was absent. And again, I think, when you're thinking about how these burnings are planned, the IRA, the local IRA, were very much aware of this, mm-hmm. because they had contacts within the estate employees.
Sure.
Right? So they were able to feed them information as to when Castlemaine wouldn't be there. So it was just his wife, his daughter, and a handful of servants who were present on the night itself. But what Costello, the IRA leader, didn't talk about in his witness statement is that a short time before, himself and his brothers and indeed a group of young men from his locality were involved in agrarianism.
What's agrarianism for?
A lot of activity in the area centering around the attempt to break up large grazier lands or landed estates for redivision amongst small uneconomic holders or the landless labourers, right?
Okay.
So Costello and his brother and friends were actually involved in this as well. And Eugene Dunn, the historian who has looked at this, has shown that the attack on the house wasn't the end of the intimidation of Castlemaine. And in fact, it went on between 1921 and 1923 until such time as almost the entire domain infrastructure was destroyed.
Okay.
Rent books, for example, were taken out and I presume burned or destroyed as well. So there was a deliberate attempt to try to ensure that Castlemaine didn't come back to reside in Moydrum. And ultimately, about 1924, of course, he sells the domain and his untenanted lands to the Irish Land Commission. And the Land Commission will then come in and they will redistribute this land amongst small local uneconomic holders. So, I mean, arguably,
that's a motive.
That's a motive
in
its own right.
And presumably the Costellos got some of the land, perhaps, when the Land Commission were dividing it up? Or?
Dunn points out that Costello had actually taken some of the land at that stage himself, right? But whether or not he held on to it remains to be seen, and we'll only know that when we can get into the Irish Land Commission records to ascertain all of these.
Sure. But that, I mean, I suppose that's one of the reasons why Costello was fighting in the first place, to address that imbalance of land ownership and so on. And so Castlemaine, he then sells his estate, which was presumably a few thousand acres, was it?
I think there was about 1,500 acres in it at that stage. Yeah.
Okay. It's so interesting when you look at a map from that era, and to see, particularly from the War of Independence, because we'll come on to this later, but it is, when we're talking about the revolution, it is in two parts in terms of the burnings. You've got the War of Independence, and of course we have the Civil War. We have 125 houses, something like that, burnt in the War of Independence. And when you look at a map of where those houses were, two things become notable. First, none are in Northern Ireland, which is interesting in itself. And secondly, most of them are in Munster, primarily Cork, I think 42 in Cork, I think. Why was it so ferocious down in Munster, in Cork?
Well, I mean, there is a direct correlation between burnings and areas which are most violent during the War of Independence, right?
Sure.
So, I mean, if you map IRA violence during the War of Independence and then you map burning of big houses, you can see immediately that there is a direct correlation. I mean, given what we've just spoken about in relation to the type of warfare, the tit-for-tat reprisal, counter-reprisal. So, I mean, houses in Cork are going to get caught up in that, for one thing. I mean, when you look at Tom Barry's memoir, I mean, Barry is effectively screaming out that, you know, at one stage, I mean, that the only worry of the local IRA was that they were going to run out of country houses to burn. Because as long as the British Crown forces continued to, you know, sack cities like Cork and burn local farmhouses and so on, then they were always going to continue to carry out their counter-reprisals.
Right, okay, so that, yeah. Crossing into County Kerry then, Derreen, is it in Kerry? I think it is.
It
Kerry,
is.
the Marquess of Lansdowne's place.
Yes.
That was targeted as well. That got a lot of press at the time. Why so?
Yeah, well, first of all, given the prominence of Lord Lansdowne himself, I mean, okay, his political star was on the wane at that stage, but prior to that, I mean, he had a very impressive political CV.
For example, had he been viceroy? No, he had
held a variety of different positions within the empire.
Yeah.
Right? Colonial office. He had been leader of the Unionist Party in the House of Lords. He had been a well-established Unionist politician, and he also had a very bad reputation, of course, as a landlord in Ireland.
In terms of evictions.
In terms of evictions and the voluntary, quote-unquote, emigration schemes that he organised from his Irish estates in the middle of the 1880s, which has been well documented by Gerard Lyne in his monumental work on the Lansdowne estates. But
so vengeance sounds like one of the motives for this one to an extent.
It could be. It could be. That's the way, again, it could be seen, right? And on the estate, especially between 22 and 23, which is essentially the period of the Civil War, there is an awful lot. There are numerous raids on the house. There are numerous raids on the domain. So the house is subject to attack, looting, but so also is the domain, right? The cutting down of trees, the pulling up of exotic shrubs and so on, and they're disappearing.
Are they taken elsewhere, or do they just torn out?
No, I would say they're taken elsewhere. But I mean, in terms of, you know, taking wood from the domains. Now, first of all, remember that the Civil War is fought during a period of economic depression. Yeah. Right. So I mean, you know, arguably, the poorer people in the district are taking trees for firewood. But then there are also those who are exploiting the market because, you know, wood is a good commodity now to be actually selling. And in some cases, when you look at the level of wood or the level of trees, the number of trees that are taken, you realize that this is not just, I mean, there's a commercial aspect to this as well. So there are letters coming into the provisional government from various different quarters around the Derreen estate, talking about you know, farmers in the locality using whatever's been taken from the house and its surroundings to build their own new sheds and out offices and all the rest. So therefore, the house is eventually burned, right? And there's a very telling remark made by the local Protestant rector, who says that in fact it would be impossible to distinguish between what he called the Free Staters and the Republicans, because they were both involved in the burning of the house and the looting and the destruction of the domain and so on that went on. So regardless of the motivations that might go all the way back to the planning campaign days, the fact that this is a very prominent unionist, they're also involved in this, once again, these agrarian issues, because ultimately Lansdowne also sells his domain and untended lands to the Land Commission about 1927 or so, and these are all redistributed amongst the local
clears out as well.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because when you take it from the perspective of the big house landowners or the people who are, I suppose, opposed to nationalism, there's quite a spectrum of people. You know, at one end you've got people who just want things to kind of stay like they are, and you know, what is this war about? And at the other, you've got people who are fully invested in the imperial dream, you know, that they've been through boarding schools and they've probably been in the army, they've been high sheriffs, and, you know, their families have been in it for generations. They probably fought at the Boyne, you know, their ancestors.
Yeah.
So for them, this is the end of everything. And that is, you know, that's why they come down so hard. At the start of this, I said that they were mostly Protestant. Is that true? Was religion relevant in this instance?
Well, arguably, right, houses are burned because they belong to Protestant loyalists, Protestant landlords, Protestant spies, Protestant collaborators, but not just because they were Protestant. Therefore, I mean, I would argue that it's not religion that is or sectarianism that is the motivating factor, or the primary motivating factor. Now, do you have Catholic houses burned? Yes, you do, right?
Okay.
And
I mean, there weren't that many big houses owned by Catholics, but there were a number.
I mean, about 5% is generally taken to be the
5%.
round about the number.
Yeah.
So, Knockabey in County Louth is one of those Catholic-owned houses that's burned. And it's the interesting local lore around this that suggests the IRA burned it deliberately so they wouldn't be accused of sectarianism.
Oh, so a token burning?
But I mean, that is lore, right?
Yeah,
so
okay.
Whatever else is involved now would need to be more thoroughly investigated.
Yeah.
Another house actually in Louth as well, I think it was Mitchelstown, when the raiders came to it. I mean, they told the owner specifically that they weren't burning it for sectarian reasons. They were burning it as a reprisal for the execution of some of their comrades earlier on.
Okay, so reprisals is going to come into the mix.
Yes,
yeah, we'll
into the mix again. Yeah,
more in the Civil War. Okay, and you've already mentioned that because the RIC have been burnt out of the barracks, so they're not in the neighbourhood. But were there attempts to stop the burnings? I mean, did people fight back? Did household staff try and resist, or any of those sort of?
Yeah, and again, this actually is one of the more difficult questions to try to address because the evidence is fairly scant. In the vast majority of cases, there is no attempt by the owners to actually fight back. Right? Now, there might be isolated cases of it, but generally speaking, the IRA or the raiders turn up on a night, usually at the front door. They knock loudly for admission and so on, and occasionally the owner will put a head out the window and say, you know, what's going on? Yeah. But generally speaking, there is no attempt to engage with them.
It's funny because some of the accounts I've read over the years seems almost like courteous, like they say, "Do come in," and we'll be waiting outside.
And again, I mean, this is, I think, one of the more fascinating dimensions to it all, that again requires a good degree of nuanced examination and interpretation, because what strikes me is the levels of restraint that are practiced, let's say by the IRA, as revolutionaries within this context. I mean, you compare what the IRA do in 1919 to 23 in Ireland, compared to what revolutionaries in Russia and the way they will treat the aristocracies, right up to more recent times, like in Ceausescu's Romania in the 1980s. I mean, where the aristocracy are treated deplorably by revolutionaries. And the evidence that you're getting, for example, from the compensation claims forms, is that the likes of Lord Mayo and Palmerston is talking about the courteous nature of the fellows, the IRA who came to the house, who gave him time to remove some of his valuables. Lady Castlemaine in Moydrum, right, despite what she goes through, also talks in the same vein about the IRA.
Was she invited to sit and watch the house
She was.
burning?
Now, whether you can say that she was invited to sit and
I'm
watch,
not sure.
right?
Yeah, that's a hard one to call.
It is. I
She
mean,
was given a chair.
There were
anyway.
two armchairs brought out for herself and her daughter to sit on. Now, I mean, is that a form of intimidation? I mean, being forced to actually look at generations of heirlooms and family possessions and memories and so on, and their home. I mean, too often we depersonalize these by just calling them big houses or country houses. Yeah. And what we're forgetting about is, I mean, these are people's homes. And there's a lovely letter from Jill Lucas Scudamore from Castleshane in County Monaghan to her mother after she hears about the burning of Castleshane, in which she says, I mean, you know, is everything we loved lost and gone forever? Like, I did so love Castleshane. I mean, that was my home. And this is coming, of course, in the aftermath of the Great War. And there just seems to be no end to this for people of her generation. And you can sense in the letter that great emotive loss that comes with the loss of your house, all your family heirlooms, including what seems to have been the only representation of their father. And that featured prominently in all of the correspondence, that they've lost the only photograph, or actually it wasn't a photograph, it was a portrait of their father. And therefore you can see that pain.
Yeah, that personalizes it massively. And I think that was the thing. I mean, presumably some of them had realized where this was going and started getting, valuable things out, but, the photographs aren't necessarily the thing you think to take. I don't, it's the big question, isn't it? What would you take if your house is about to go up on fire and you've got half an hour, or I don't know how long they even get?
Exactly. I mean, in most cases, it seems to be 15 minutes. So 15 minutes to 30 minutes tops. And you get there for what, was it Lady Daisy Fingal describes as, if you like, the bric-a-brac that is thrown around the front lawns afterwards. Because when you go in to take out, what do you actually take out? But again, here's an area that is really ripe for future research. What was lost? I mean, will it ever be possible to actually, judge the extent of the loss in relation to collections of art and silver?
I know, all of that, all the books, antiques, decorative arts. You mentioned earlier that they were going, that people were going into the gardens and taking out the shrubs and so forth. I know Duckett's Grove, a lot of the sculptures that were in the gardens there were, vanished.
That's right.
Presumably, auctioneers were quite busy through the late 20s and 30s, offloading things. But
and you can see, I mean, even, for example, auctions in New York, in the 1920s, where silver is beginning to turn up. That, for example, originally was in Moydrum. Now, had the family got rid of that before the actual attack on the house, is something that would need to be established. But the raid or when the anti-Treatyites occupied Mitchelstown Castle in Cork.
I mean, Mitchelstown Castle, that's just a fact. I mean, because it's enormous. Was it the biggest house in Ireland?
I would say it was definitely one of the biggest houses. It was certainly the biggest neo-Gothic castle.
Right, right on the site where we get our Mitchelstown butter and Dairygold, isn't
it?
Right.
Indeed.
Okay. I've been there. I've seen the wall gardens are still sort of in existence there, but the house itself, if listeners or viewers should look at a photograph of it, because it was phenomenal. The Earls of Kingston. What was what's the story there?
Well, again, this is a Civil War burning, so the house is occupied by the anti-Treatyites, led by a local son of a farmer by the name of Pa Luddy. And when they hear that the National Army are approaching, they vacate and they burn it before they leave, right? But there are stories about when they're actually there, some of the damage that they cause to the interior of the house. For example, they allegedly used shards of glass to play darts with a Rembrandt painting, right? But a couple of nights before, the William Webber and whatever company was in the house with him itself before he left, they put a lot of the valuables away, locked them into rooms and so on, but they seem to have been literally taken back out again. And this is one of the better documented houses in relation to the extent of looting that goes on. So when the Free State government sends down an inspector in relation to the compensation claim to try to establish, what was lost, I mean, he does go through it, fair in some detail, and he makes the point that it's unlikely that the silver had been lost in the fire. There would have been some evidence of it. So instead, I mean, he argues that it had been taken out. Locals quoted in newspapers and so on substantiate that to some extent. You have cases of local people going to local jewelers and offering them smaller pieces of silver and so on. And then many years later, Alexander King Harman, who inherited the ruin, receives a letter from somebody who tells him that a fairly large collection of paintings are presently going up for auction in London, and that he'd been reliably informed by a member of the anti-treatyites that these had actually come from Mitchelstown Castle. Now, in the present, it would probably be very difficult to substantiate that, but at the same time, one shouldn't be cynical enough to actually think that it couldn't happen or that it might not have happened. But the other thing about looting that I think is interesting is that, so when the castle goes up, there's no doubt that probably the furniture and so on had been put into the middle of the rooms and sprinkled with paraffin, windows broken and so on. The type of thing that happens in all houses.
That's how it works.
Yes.
They turn up with some sledgehammers to create holes in the ceilings and so that the draft is going to come through. Yeah. Pile all the furniture in the centre of a room, covered in paraffin or petrol perhaps. Out with the Maguire and Pattersons. Yeah. Off you go.
Up it goes. Right. Right. So I mean, furniture obviously is going to be a prime casualty of all of this, but the basement furniture, right? Butler, the inspector who goes to Mitchelstown and other witnesses would claim been cleared out completely and ended up in local homes, local houses. So this is the more basic type furniture that would have been in the servants' quarters. So more likely to be practical and useful to local people than the type of furniture that was obviously constructed for the castle itself, within the castle itself, absolutely useless in that respect. And the type of looting that takes place then in other houses from the farmyards, the farm machinery, for example, right? Arguably a plough is far more important to a local farmer than a silvery pern.
So that sort of stuff was also.
So that sort of stuff was very much
up for grabs
of this. Yeah.
Okay, so the Civil War, it breaks out in June 1922. I think we're thinking maybe 150 houses burnt over the course of that. When you look at the map again, you can see the patterns. Yeah. Not much change down in Munster. It's still the hot spot. Right. Tipperary has taken over from Cork in being in the predominant place. What is notable is that Northern Ireland has now got a little bit of activity going on up there. I think 8 houses burned. Yeah. Why the sudden spate up there?
But, well, first of all, Alwyn Purdue has pointed out in our wonderful work on the decline of the big house in the north of Ireland. I mean, no houses are burned there in the War of Independence, right? Of course, it's because of the different demography, obviously, right? But in May 1922, the IRA offensive, which was literally intended to break down what they refer to as the so-called government of Northern Ireland, there was a targeting of houses that belonged to people who were involved in the administration.
So this is before the Civil War?
No, this is, yeah, May 1922 or so,
Okay,
right? And so you can see that pattern of the houses that are burned that are links to those who are fairly prominent in the administration, right? But Professor Purdue also points out very astutely that while this may seem to be the most obvious reason, there's no reason to expect that there may not have been other ulterior motives as well, related to landlords and landlordism and
the motives we mentioned earlier.
Motives we spoke
And,
about.
then in across the rest of Ireland, were the motives for burning in the Civil War much the same as the War of Independence, or is there any change there?
Yeah, well, again, I mean, you've houses like we spoke about already, Mitchelstown, that are taken over by the anti-treatyites, and they're used as billets or temporary barracks, and they're burned as they retreat. Okay. But there is definitely a rise in agrarian-related motives. And, you know, historians such as Gemma Clark, Ciarán Riley, James S. Donnelly suggested at the end of his article on burnings in Cork during the War of Independence that there is a notable rise in agrarian motives. But again, you have an escalation in agrarian crime throughout the country. And the map that you're talking about, when you look at it, what you realize is that even though there are a significant number of counties that are not involved in the military struggle in the Civil War, yet they make up for about 40% or so of the big houses burned, which is suggesting the other reasons that there has to be for these. And again, we're coming back to, you know, the struggle for land and this last phase of land war that has begun in 1917 and essentially ends in 1923.
Right, okay, yeah. But reprisals are going to have an impact on the houses.
And in this case, in relation to reprisals for the execution of anti-treatyites.
Of which a huge number were executed.
79, I think we used to refer to the 77, but I believe the number has now been up to 79. And yes, I mean, the orders which have been issued by Republican headquarters is that homes of those who are supporters of the new administration or the new regime,
the Free State government,
are to be legitimate targets.
Okay.
And of course, a number of these are senators who come from the old aristocratic class, right, who now find themselves the target of reprisals from the anti-treatyites because of the fact that they're supporters of the Free State regime.
Oh, that's rock and hard place territory in a way.
It is.
I mean, they've played the game, they've got involved, and now they're on the wrong side. Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe some examples of that, Terry.
Well, you have Palmerston House in County Kildare, which is the home of the Earl of Mayo. A short time before, there were 7 anti-treatyites executed on the Curragh. So when the raiders come to Palmerston House, they announce to him that they're there to burn his house as a reprisal for those executions. And again, that's an interesting one in respect of what he manages to save. There's about 5 or 6, you know, old masters' paintings that he manages to actually get out of there. But he does also make the point that before the raid, he had managed to get most of the important contents away.
He got it out.
But there's no inventories of these, you see, and so that's why we'll probably never know what the extent of all the destruction actually, or the loss was. Mullaboden, same county, same reason, Sir Brian Mahon's, and there is a lovely anecdotal story there about the IRA dressing up in his British Army uniform and marching to his gramophone records. Military records outside and so on.
Okay.
You have Ballynastraw in County Wexford.
Sir
Thomas Esmond. And of course, Sir Thomas Esmond had been an Irish nationalist MP for decades. And largely as a reward for this, I mean, he's appointed to the Senate and feels particularly aggrieved by the fact that his house is destroyed.
So that's a classic example of the madness, really, of the times. I mean, he's a nationalist MP.
Yeah.
I suppose it is a civil war.
Yeah.
Was he particularly outspoken in support of the Free State? Or?
Not particularly so. Not particularly so. It's a case of, and which is true of a lot of these, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But he's not only aggrieved by the fact that his house is burned, but he's also aggrieved by the way the Free State government actually treat him in relation to his compensation claim.
Okay, well, I mean, that's definitely a really interesting topic as well, the compensation claim. I was thinking about this because, okay, so after the Free State hasn't got a lot of money to play with, really.
Yeah.
But it is prepared to try and compensate those who've lost big houses. But there must be a difference between people who lost their big house in the War of Independence and those who lost their house in the Civil War, for starters. That's a blurry line.
Yeah.
And how much are you going to give them back? You're not going to give the King family enough money to rebuild Mitchelstown Castle.
No, and I mean, the general consensus is that, I mean, it's a waste of money paying out these ginormous sums to rebuild houses that are essentially white elephants on the landscape anyway, right? But now compensation is a very complex area. During the War of Independence, initially, compensation would have been paid based on the 1898 Local Government Act. And that meant that it was the ratepayers who were responsible for malicious damage. Because of the extent of violence and damage to property, legislation was introduced in 1919 and 1920. Now, you would have sympathetic county court judges awarding almost the full extent of the claims made by owners, but it's not been paid out because the county councils are responsible for raising it off the ratepayers, and by 1920 the county councils have been taken over by Sinn Féin. So after the signing of the treaty, then a commission is set up, and it has decided that the British will pay for the damage they did, the Irish will pay for the damage that they did. So the process begins again, and the original awards are very much diminished and not always paid.
So, sorry, with that, that's the British going to pay for the damage to Cork City, or is it as well as houses, or
that's the intention.
Okay,
that's the intention.
And the Irish are also going to pay for the damage they've done to houses and barracks.
Yeah.
Okay, it's a big bill.
It's huge, and you see, imagine like big houses are only 300 in what's tens of thousands of compensation claims. Yeah. And you've got to consider, very much consider that as well. Sure. So again, I suppose to make a long story short, what eventually happens is the original claims are diminished down to almost about 21% of the original claims that are made by the owners. Then it becomes further complicated then during the Civil War, because now the Free State government introduces a Compensation Act in 1923, right? And it has a variety of different clauses that, essentially try to limit as much as possible the compensation that's going to be paid to big house owners. And Clause 10 stipulates that, for example, compensation can be awarded for the rebuilding on the original site. But not very many want to do that. There are some who will, but not very many want to do that. If you don't take that, you can take diminished compensation and rebuild elsewhere.
Okay. Now
this is interesting because what happens therefore is the likes of the owners of Mitchelstown Castle or J.M. Wilson and Curry Gran in Longford, they will take the lower compensation level that's available to them, but they will build suburban villas, for example, in Wilson's case, in and around Kingstown or
in the
area.
Okay,
Dunleary,
so they stay in the area.
No. We're going from Longford to Dunleary to build them, right? Yeah. Mitchelstown, I think the houses, if memory serves me right, the houses are built around Clontarf, the Clontarf area of Dublin, right?
Okay.
So in one place, the historic country house domain landscape is disappearing.
Yes.
And in another place, the money that is being received is adding to the urban landscape. Does that make sense?
Yes, okay, I can see that. Right, okay.
So the government's intention really is to ensure that this time the money is not going to leave Ireland.
It doesn't leave Ireland, but it does leave the area, and this is one of the questions I wanted to ask, is you know, if you burn a big house and the family leave,
Yes.
then you are removing, perhaps deliberately, that domain infrastructure, and that is leaving a lot of people maybe without work, without choice.
Yeah.
Is it not killing the goose and the golden egg?
Yeah, and again, I mean, if there is a study that really needs to begin around about 1903 with the passing of the Wyndham Land Act, and the impact that that has on the abandonment of country houses, families moving out of the area completely, and what the consequences therefore are for the local economy, right? Now, the same thing applies during the revolutionary period. So you do actually have estate employees petitioning the government to try to protect the big house that they're working for. The workers on the Bessborough estate, for example. There's about 500 of them, right? So they're effectively petitioning the government to try to ensure that the house is not burned, because if the house is burned, their livelihoods go with it.
Okay.
So, I mean, there are local community groups who are doing this. In Limerick, the Knight of Glyn's family gets support from the Free State government that ensures that Glyn survives, as it does, of course, up to the present day. So the reasons why big houses were not burned is just as interesting as the reasons why houses were burned, right? And again, lots of anecdotal stories about the IRA come to Carton and they're told that this is an ancestral home of Lord Edward Fitzgerald, and then they move away, right? But what's most likely in this case, again, is the impact that the burning of the house would have had on the local economy, on the town, for example, of Maynooth. And you get that in editorials in the local newspapers, because at that stage, of course, the house has been lost to the family through that, great scandalous gamble,
yes,
right, by the Seven Duke, and Sir Henry Malaby Deely, who takes it over. I mean, the editorial in the local newspaper says, I mean, effectively, don't think about coming in here and changing the dynamic of the local community that's so dependent upon Carton for their livelihoods, right?
Yeah.
Which he doesn't, right? In fairness to him, which he doesn't. So what is local lore and what is the reality are, two very different things.
They are, yes. Okay. I mean, that's the thing. Okay, so we've got, as you've said, a huge number of new records have come available over the last 10, 15 years.
Yeah.
And you've compiled so much into this amazing book. What are we going to learn? My final question to you, what are we going to learn over the coming future? What records have we yet to sort of peruse and look through?
Yeah, well, for any one historian to attempt to get through all of them, right, is an impossibility, right? So that's what I said. I've taken a number of case studies, because each of the 300 houses that's burned has its own individual story to tell, right? So you can present an overview, right? But I mean, the more we delve into each individual case study, the more we will learn about the complexities, not just of Irish history and a new dimension to the revolutionary period, but the complex role of the country house in Irish society.
Yes.
So, I mean, there's still room for lots and lots more.
And the Land Commission records as well.
The Land Commission records, which I've been talking about for 25 years, I mean, to me, they're the founding records of the state. And I mean, if there is, 8 million documents there, what they have to tell us in relation to this period, the revolutionary period, they will help reveal to us how the revolution played itself out long after 1923. Let alone everything else that they have to offer to us.
Well, what a resource that will be, Terry. I look forward to interviewing you about the Land Commission records when you've gone through those 8 million files. We'll get you back here. Terry, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your wonderful insights into all of this. And, well, I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. For details about the work of the RDS, please visit www.rds.ie and check out the RDS Library and Archives section. Terry's book, as I say, is The Burning of the Big House from Yale University Press. Thank you again, Terry.
Thank you, Turtle.